Welcome, members and friends, visitors and guests to the Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church. I'm Deborah Navgardoff, a member of the Board of Trustees. Unitarian Universalists respect the sacred texts of all religions, but reject dogmatic beliefs and rigid creeds. Our congregation includes humanists, Jews, Buddhists and Christians, believers and agnostics, people bringing previous religious connections, and those searching for deeper meaning in their lives. Wherever you come from, wherever you are, and wherever you may be going, you are welcome. We have just a few announcements today. The Justice Coordinating Council is taking the books out of the conference room at the farmhouse. This is to make room for the Justice Center's books. Monday, tomorrow, is the last day you can come to take books. Please contact Debbie in the office if you plan to come over tomorrow. As you've probably heard by now, the House Committee proposes enclosing a portion of the covered walkway that's being built this fall, allowing us to enter our church into a pleasing vestibule rather than into a crowded hallway. Constructing the vestibule at the same time as our new covered entrance will be more efficient, easier, and likely less expensive. We have an estimate of $29,200 for constructing the vestibule. Following Ann Dorsback's initial gift toward the vestibule, a number of individuals and families have pledged to contribute to this project. We had a new donation this week. A total of $23,100 has been pledged to this project, leaving us just $6,100 short of the funds necessary to complete it. If you'd like to contribute, please contact Debbie Horvey, Steve Sargent, or me, Deborah Navgardoff, and thank you ever so much. Join us for coffee chats Monday to Thursday or happy hour on Friday. The links are up on our website. This Wednesday, Reverend Kathy is our special guest. And then next Wednesday, and I'm going to use the last name I can pronounce here, Katie Donner, our new choir director, will be our featured guest. We're beginning to develop a process for choosing a new name for our community. Check out an article in the August Tapestry that isn't out yet, but will be coming, that provides an overview. That's all for now. Thank you and have a great week.
Good morning. My name is Marie Geary. I am a member of the Sunday Service Planning Committee, and I will be hosting today's service. I will now light the chalice. The Reverend Sarah Asher wrote, "May the light from this flame be a celebration of the truth, meaning, and joy we find within these walls and in our dreams." Our opening words today are from Lisa Cron in Wired for Story. Story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told us what to hang on to. Graham Shelby is a true story writer. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Reader's Digest, The Moth, and through NPR. And he still manages to write speeches and do other work for the Louisville Mayor's office. And more importantly, he helps his wife raise triplet sons.
Thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity to come here today and to speak. And as has been my habit, the other times I've done this, I came into the sanctuary and then I went out to just go over my notes a little bit in the coffee area. Of course, the coffee area doesn't have any tables anymore. That's part of the casualties of COVID-19. But it is lovely to be here and to see all of you on the screen, if admittedly a bit surreal. So I ask your patience as I adapt to this new context. I'll also say I did address storytelling in a similar talk in 2016. I remember that as I was going through my notes here at TJ. Of course, a few things have happened since then. So while some of the material it may be a little bit familiar, there's a lot of updates as well to accommodate the changes in our local and national stories since then. So I've been telling stories for a long time, since I was a kid. And this is something my parents like to talk about to the interest of no one so much as themselves. But one of the stories, I had like a whole series of stories I used to like to make up where I was the son of Superman and my father had left the earth, leaving me to fight his battles. And there was just something about the creation of a story and the pattern of it. You had the obstacle, the struggle, the breakthrough, the resolution, and the infinite variables within that set pattern. And I loved it. I loved experiencing it and I loved creating it. And that's, true of lots of people. And it's actually true of humanity as a whole and always has been. Storytelling is perhaps our oldest art form. I mean, one of the ways I think about this is just to think about this exact spot here in what we now call Louisville, Kentucky, USA. That the first humans came here thousands of years ago, and we don't even know their name, their language, know almost nothing about them. But knowing what we do know about people, we can safely assume that they told stories. And it's easy to imagine them here, kind of on this high ground up from the river at night, looking through trees taller than anything we've perhaps seen in our lifetimes here, up at the sky and sharing stories. One story we do have from much more recent era, though, is a story of in the Native American tradition in which people looked at the stars and they saw a configuration of stars, 7 stars, and there was a story of 7 young men who were trying to evade work, and they were being pursued and going to be punished by their mothers for avoiding their chores. So they did a dance of prayer to be rescued, and they were lifted up into the sky, and that became the 7 stars. When the ancient Greeks saw that same configuration, they created the story of the Pleiades. This is just the basic function that we have as people, is to use our storytelling instinct to explain the world. And one thing that really pains me as a lover of stories is to think about how many stories, thousands of years worth of stories, that people created and told and retold that we will never know. We only have a few indications, cave art from around the world depicting great hunts, for example, and a few characters that have survived, interestingly. One of those is the character Loki. From ancient Norse mythology, his origins are more than 1,000 years old. He has survived all the way into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where he appears in the Thor and Avengers movies. As a culture, as we expand our view and expand the number and the range of stories, traditions that we celebrate, we have the opportunity and I think the obligation to celebrate mythological characters and their stories from other traditions. Loki is an archetype. He's known as a trickster, and there are trickster characters from traditions all around the world. We're experiencing a bit of echo. Just a moment. We're good. No? There are a series of trickster characters from around the world who have similar traits, although they're also distinct, to their cultures. Anansi the spider from West Africa, China's Monkey King, and the Hawaiian trickster superhero Maui, for whom the island is named. And as you look back at history, stories serve as entertainment, but also as lessons and as tools to teach about the universe. When I was a boy, I mentioned Greek mythology. I loved Greek mythology, Hercules, Odysseus, Artemis, the all-stars. And the more I read, the more I realized that, these were great stories and magical tales to me, but one person's myth can be another person's faith. And one of the reasons that this evolves is because part of our storytelling instinct is to fill in blanks in the universe. And in this way, we're sort of all detectives, always have been. We have, a series of facts, but they don't give us the whole picture. So we use our imaginations, our storytelling minds to fill in those blanks. For example, an ancient set of people might have said, the crops are failing. We have no rain. Why won't it rain? The gods are angry. Well, why are the gods angry? Because... And here's where storytelling as a potential tool for manipulation comes in, because real life doesn't always flow like a story. Story is a construct, a pattern that we impose on the world to make order out of the chaos that we often find. And what often happens is that the person who gets there first, who tells the story first, sets that narrative. And once a narrative is set, it can be very hard to change, particularly narratives that key on people's most primal instincts: fear, sadness, anger, loss, joy, and hope. And storytelling is really an emotional language. If you're watching or listening to a story, if you don't feel it, if you don't feel for the characters, fiction or nonfiction, the story doesn't work. And that's because storytelling is it's very primal. It's an instinct we have as human beings. And lots of people from lots of different angles have studied this. The Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Shiller, he wrote a book called Narrative Economics. He writes, "The human species, everywhere you go, is engaged in conversation. We're wired for it. The human brain is built around narratives. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, but that may be something of a misnomer. Sapiens means wise. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould said we should be called Homo narrator. Your mind is really built for narratives, and especially narratives about other humans. And narratives are contagious. They spread from one person to another. Some narratives disappear quickly. Others can last a long time." When Schiller says we're wired for storytelling and story consuming, that's literally true. Because stories work in our brains on a neurological level. You watch, read, or listen to a story that describes a harrowing or emotionally charged event, and your brain releases smaller doses of the same chemicals it would if you were actually kissing a long-lost love or running from a horde of zombies. The psychologist Lisa Peterson writes in the Harvard Business Review, "Scientists are discovering that chemicals like cortisol, dopamine, and oxytocin are released in the brain when we're told a story. Cortisol assists with our formulating memories. Dopamine, which helps to regulate our emotional responses, keeps us engaged. And when it comes to creating deeper connections with others, oxytocin is associated with empathy." Oxytocin is really important in the whole storytelling equation. Another researcher, Paul Zak, writes, "Oxytocin is produced when we are trusted or shown a kindness, and it motivates cooperation. It does this by enhancing the sense of empathy." So when you identify with a character or narrator, your brain is feeling the effects of oxytocin. That's why you can hear about, the massive starvation involving millions of people in another country and just change the channel. But you're more likely to be moved to pull out your credit card when you hear the story of one little boy or one little girl in one place who doesn't have enough to eat. That's your brain on oxytocin. And in fact, they've done studies where they've taken people and put them in MRI machines and told them stories or shown them stories and examine what happens in their brain. And multiple parts of the brain light up, reflecting sensory input, emotional input, data and other forms of information. And I feel like the best stories are the ones that hit the most different parts of the brain of the user, of the listener. And that's just part of the dynamic of storytelling. But before we go any further with that, let me just talk for a minute about what a story actually is. So obviously you can look in various places for various definitions of this. I've done this. I didn't like any of them. And because this is the sort of nerd I am, it's always important to identify which type of nerd you are. I came up with my own that I like a lot better. And I think of story is a narrative of transformation, i.e. a sequence of events that led the teller to change, grow, or mature. But transformation is really the heart of what a story is. And one element of this, you have to have a main character who wants to achieve a definable goal. Again, main character who wants to achieve a definable goal. Here's just some examples. In The Lion King, Simba wants to be king. In Wonder Woman, the movie, she wants to kill Ares, the god of war, and bring peace to the world. In A Raisin in the Sun, Walter Lee Younger wants to open a liquor store and make more money for his family. How it usually works, the character goes along, then something happens to create problems, conflicts. For example, in The Lion King, Simba's father is killed by his evil brother, and Simba blames himself. Then to overcome the challenge, they typically have to struggle for a while and then face a fear or overcome a previous obstacle. There's an internal and external element of the struggle that they have to overcome. And they have to take an active role in changing their circumstances. Like Simba returns to face his evil Uncle Scar, who has taken over the kingdom, and the kingdom is in ruin. That's really essential. The passive or active versus passive is essential to creating a satisfying resolution for the story. If The Lion King ended with Simba being told by his childhood friend Nala, hey, why don't you come back and take over the kingdom, Scar's dead and, it'd be pretty easy. That wouldn't be very satisfying. But since she comes and says, we need you to defeat him, and he has to actively decide to do that, that's what makes it satisfying. It's the active role that the protagonist takes to change circumstances that really creates a story. And that aspect of it, the protagonist taking an active role in changing circumstances, is where I want to transition from the world of fictional stories to the world of true stories, because really the fundamental elements are the same in both spheres. In the first place, I want to talk about where this works, where true stories happen, and where the elements of storytelling come to life in, I think, a really powerful way that I've had the honor to experience over the last few years, is in performance settings, specifically the Moth. If we were here, I'd ask you to raise your hand. Some of you are familiar with the Moth, but I'll just say that I suspect a few of you are. Oh, thank you. Good. The Moth is a nonprofit based in New York City that's dedicated to the art of spoken word storytelling and the telling of true stories. They sponsor the Moth Radio Hour, heard on public radio stations, and the Moth Podcast, and also a series of storytelling events in Louisville and around the English-speaking world. Some of them are competitive, story slams, they're called, and others are curated. And they've been they're really incredible, and I really encourage people to check them out, because especially for me, what's been invaluable about them is, I'm a straight white American male, and I've spent most of my life in Kentucky. And through the storytelling I've heard on the Moth and other places, but principally there, I've gotten to have insights into the lives of people with vastly different experiences than my own. Like Ray Christian, whose story Watercolor described his experience as the first black Boy Scout in his troop to win the swimming competition at a Georgia summer camp in the early 1960s. Or Jennifer Hickson, whose story Smoke helped me understand, in some way, what it's like to be in and to escape from an abusive relationship. Or Ernesto Quinones, whose devastating story, Spanish Harlem 7th grade, detailed his own journey from being a victim of bullying to doing victimizing of his own. And he told it and owned it in a way that's incredibly powerful. And hearing this is the power of personal stories. And it follows that same pattern of, goal, obstacle, struggle, breakthrough. But what sets the moth apart is the ability to get people to tell stories with what I call focused authenticity. And this is really key if you're going to do storytelling of your own in, just with friends or in a more public setting, is to follow this basic set of guidelines. Focused authenticity is important. Focused because at the Moth, the stories have limited time, 5 minutes or 10 minutes usually. And that's important because we've all had the experience of being trapped in someone else's story, and it's not a great feeling. And we've all had many of us, myself included, have had the experience of telling a story and thinking, this is great. Everybody's loving this. I wish this could go on forever. And the audience is thinking that it already is. So the focus part means keeping empathy with your audience in terms of time and subject, but also authentic, because in the Moth, we don't use props or notes. You can't hide, you just have to talk. The Moth, by the way, happens on the last Tuesday of every month here in Louisville, virtually now, including this coming Tuesday. I'd encourage everybody to check it out. And I've noticed over the years, though, in the live settings, people fear. There are people in the world, perhaps some of you here as well, who fear the prospect of telling a personal story in front of strangers more than they fear death. And I understand that. But what I've observed, why I encourage people to try it in whatever context, is that and cleansing. And people who go up and they're afraid that by sharing something of their own lives, they will lose people's respect, actually gain respect by having the courage to share and to own their own experience in this way. And there is also something about telling a story about a difficult moment that does give you a sense of ownership over it and of the struggle and the breakthrough that you had in your own personal experience. I spoke with, when I was working in my work with the Moth, I spoke with their artistic director. Her name's Catherine Burns. She says she wants people to tell stories that are real but not raw, and to tell stories from your scars and not your wounds. They've seen tellers break down on stage or start improvising, and particularly some people struggle when they tell a story about someone involving someone who's died, a loved one. Although for me, this is actually one of the great joys of storytelling. Because while some people feel like, they experience the loss of a person again, for me, it's the opposite. The story I told at the Moth in New York a few years ago was about meeting my birth father, a man I saw for the first time when he appeared on national television on the CBS Evening News. I know that sounds like a pretty weird story, doesn't it? That's why I pitched it to the Moth. And in telling it, there was a moment, and there was some struggle in the process. But to stand up in front of this crowd of people and get to introduce them to this man who I knew for the last 25 years of his life, and have them meet him in this odd way as I did, and then later get to know him, lose him, and remember him all in about 10 minutes. It felt like, in a sense, bringing him briefly back to life and honoring him in the same way. And then afterward, feeling this sense of connection with people who found the story meaningful. Not everyone did, but a few did and told me so. And that's one of the purposes that storytelling has, and I think one of the opportunities it provides for us, is to establish an emotional connection with people we don't know or may never know, or to establish one with people we will get to know. And that's why storytelling is a powerful tool, the emotional connectivity that it can produce. And this is why it's a powerful tool in other contexts as well. And my work with the Moth actually was sort of transformative for me in another way, because it changed my perspective on stories, how they work, and on how widespread they are, how so much of our lives, even in public contexts, revolve around storytelling, and indeed also around the idea of storytelling contests. In business, for example, storytelling's been a huge buzzword for years now. Fast Company magazine wrote, "Storytelling is the ultimate weapon." And this idea is key in advertising and marketing, where individual people are involved in a struggle feel-good commercial. There's like someone having some sort of personal struggle. And then the product that's being sold is the key to their transformation. That's how the storytelling elements come together there. Also, Microsoft, Nike, IBM are just a few of the companies that have employed a chief storyteller. That's an actual job. Or chief storytelling officer. How do I get one of these jobs? As part of their efforts. Microsoft's storyteller is his name's Steve Clayton, and he said it's very easy to slip into celebrating yourself and celebrating your product, but it's a lot more rewarding to go and find stories of where those products actually have an impact. And one example he gave was Microsoft went to a Kenyan village and helped local entrepreneurs get connected to Wi-Fi. Which brings up another aspect that we need to understand when we look at storytelling in the public sphere, and that is that storytelling is very selective. When people tell their own stories, they're not going to be objective. People might tell ones that compromise themselves in some way, but they also don't. They also tell stories to promote themselves and what they do. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's something that we need to be fully aware of as we consume stories. And now I feel like we're consuming more stories than ever. They're around us all the time. Another place that I discovered that storytelling was absolutely fundamental is in the legal system. A few years ago, I was the foreman on a jury, and about halfway through the process, I realized that what I was basically participating in was a high-stakes storytelling contest. Sure, there was the law, there was precedent, there was evidence, but basically the lawyers representing the two different sides were telling a story. And we in the jury were going to decide which story worked for us the best. Facts and the law were factors in it, but the story was as significant, if not more, than anything else. Story also leads us to war. The reason that I met my father for the first time or saw him for the first time on television rather than in person was because he was a Vietnam War combat veteran who had severe PTSD, and that had led my mother to leave him and take me when I was a baby. And in talking with him and in talking about why he had gone to war, I realized that, he had gone in part because of a story. The story that our democracy, our way of life was under threat, and that it needed young men like him in 1968 to go to Vietnam to defend it. And that story has been told for millennia, or one like it. And its relationship with reality varies, and always has. But, fundamentally, we should always be aware that it takes a story to turn a rice field into a battlefield. It takes a story to turn a young man or woman into a soldier. And it takes a story to turn a stranger into an enemy that you'll kill if you'll have the chance. And when I say it takes a story, that doesn't mean that story is false. But it also doesn't mean it's true or entirely true. Story is agnostic to the truth. It can go either way. And it's just, I've known people over the years who go to storytelling festivals. I've been to storytelling festivals. They're wonderful. But who I feel like viewed stories as this kind of holy thing, a holy art form, then that was inherently good. And I don't see it that way. Story is a method of communication, and it can be used for whatever purpose the communicator wants to, if he or she is skilled enough to use it. And that brings me to how storytelling works in political campaigns, another high-stakes story slam. One of the people that I've been learning from recently in this is a man named Mark McKinnon. And he's an interesting character. He's worked with both Democratic and Republican candidates. He was a musician when he was young, and he lives in Austin, Texas. And one of the things that he's quoted as saying is that so the great thing about music, he was asked the overlap, the similarities between music and politics. And he said, the great thing about music is it's all about storytelling, and so is politics. Great campaigns and great candidates are all about telling great stories. There's a narrative architecture to great campaigns, just like there is to great music. He said that narrative architecture, it's like a magnet, and voters are like iron filings. And he laid out what that architecture looks like, which I feel like I should have, I really want to write this on a board behind me, but I'll just have to say as clearly as I can. So he broke it down this way, that the architecture looks like this, that in a campaign, and if you want to tell a story, you need these elements. There's a threat or an opportunity. It's fear or hope. There's a victim, there's a villain, there's a resolution, and there's a hero. And McKinnon started off, he worked with Democrats, and he transitioned to working with more Republican candidates, including George W. Bush. And he talked about how they applied that framework in the 2000 and 2004 presidential campaigns, both of which, going into them, the conventional wisdom was that Bush would lose. In 2004, the Iraq War had been going on, and Bush was not popular. But here's how they broke down the narrative framework. The threat was international terrorism. The fear was more attacks. The victims were people who were killed on 9/11. The villain was Al-Qaeda. The resolution was aggressive policy against foreign threats. And the hero was George W. Bush. And that was the architecture that they used that fueled their ads, and Bush narrowly won re-election. And it should be said that this is a bipartisan, storytelling in campaigns is a bipartisan tactic that people use in different campaigns in different ways and always have. And interestingly, McKinnon worked for the McCain campaign in 2008, but he told John McCain when he signed on that he would advise him, but that if Barack Obama won the Democratic nomination, that McKinnon would have to resign. Because even though he disagreed with Obama on policy, he felt that the story of this man becoming president of the United States was too compelling, too powerful, too important for the country, and he wouldn't oppose him. And he was true to his word. When Barack Obama won the Democratic nomination in 2008, McKinnon left the McCain campaign. And I think it speaks to a truth about storytelling, often in the public sphere, and that is that for many people, story beats facts. Not everyone, not all the time, but it happens. And often if a story feels true, many people don't worry that much about exactly how true it is. But the basic tenet of stories as narrative transformation, I still think that holds true. And I think in most contexts, I think that's true in most contexts. In my own work, with people running for office, the question that I've often asked them or urged them to be clear about is, what is the transformation you're trying to create? Who is your audience? What do they want? What is their story? And that one thing that's key in convincing anyone to do anything is finding a way to authentically align the story of your campaign with the stories of your audience. And another key about storytelling in the public and professional context is to remember that everyone is the protagonist. Everyone is their own protagonist. Everyone is the hero of their own story. And sometimes I feel like we've become in some way a nation of storytellers, like to a fault, and that we can be so entrenched in our own stories, we don't pay enough attention to those of others, all others, even those whose stories make us suspicious or uncomfortable, and we need to. The movement we're seeing on the streets of America right now is to some degree people insisting that their stories be heard and respected by a culture that hasn't done that. I feel like in some ways, I'm thinking we're falling prey to something that the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie speaks about in a wonderful TED Talk she did about what she called the danger of the single story. She grew up in Nigeria, describes her childhood as mostly happy, safe, and prosperous until instability came to the country, and then her parents, fell on hard times, although, I think her mother was a teacher, her father worked at a college, they had servants. And when she came to America for school, she had a roommate who asked her one day to play her some of her native music. Chimamanda didn't know exactly what to play her, so she just showed her one of her favorite tapes, and her roommate was disappointed that it was Mariah Carey. she said, this is a quote from Chiminade Adichie, let's see. She talked about how it was frustrating that her roommate had a single story of who she would be because of where she came from. To overlook, and what she said, that to do that, she says, quote, is to flatten my experience and overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes. The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. She encountered the notion that we were all, single stories in college, and she said that her roommate felt sorry for her even before she knew her. And that the danger of our storytelling instinct is that stories can become a kind of shorthand. We see the signs of a pattern and think we know all we need to know, that we've solved the mystery of a person, a place, a group of people, when in fact it's always much, much more complicated with that. As someone whose roots are in Appalachia, this resonated with me immediately, a place that has too often been victim of stereotypes, and it is a beautiful, complicated place with people who deserve more respect than I feel like they've gotten in the broader culture historically. And that's a feeling that lots of people in lots of places have. And we're in a time when we have the power, it seems, to change that. So in closing, I know I've put a lot of threads out there about how storytelling works, but to bring them all together in this moment, it does feel strange that we're almost unbelievable, really, that in the story of our city and our country, here we are about 3 months from a presidential election, and the election almost feels like an afterthought, because it often gets sort of squeezed out of our attention by more immediate concerns, the conflict and struggles we're having related to COVID-19, to the economy, and to the demonstrations for racial justice. But as we look at the next 3 months, the election and beyond, as a city, as a community, as a country, we are in this moment where it seems to me we're between, in some sense, the introduction of the obstacle in our story and the turning point when we'll make the difficult choice that will lead us to transformation. And I ask that we all think about the transformation we want to create a better and more just community and country, and that we make the choices and put in the work to make that a reality. And as we do that, remember that storytelling is communication, a two-way art form, and that for our stories to resonate, to have meaning and impact, we have to always remember, recognize, and respect that in our story community, sometimes we have to tell, sometimes we have to listen, and always we have to hear. Thank you.
Hi, I've just found out that none of the titles of my pieces are on the screen, and I picked them only because of the titles having to do with short stories. So I wanted you to know the first one was a little story, and the next one I'm playing is called Just a Story, and the last one is a sad story with a happy ending. Thanks.
With the words from Maddie Cephantis. After I read these words, I will then go and blow out the flame. But I want to say from Maddie, we extinguish this flame, but we keep its light in our hearts with its message of love and justice. Words are go in peace and awareness of the rights of all. A smile and reaching out a hand of kindness will always be remembered. Thank you.